The shovel struck something that wasn't dirt, something that cracked like old porcelain and sent a metallic taste crawling up Samuel Morrison's throat. In the suffocating August heat of 1947, beneath the collapsed floorboards of what locals called the Hartwell place, Morrison had just unearthed the first of 43 human skulls. This discovery would unravel the most disturbing family secret in American criminal history, one that had festered in the remote hills of Devil's Fork, West Virginia, for over 2 decades. Morrison, a surveyor from nearby Millfield, had been commissioned by the state to assess the abandoned property for potential sale when his measurements led him to a depression in the earth where the kitchen floor had rotted through. The stench that rose from that cavity wasn't the usual mildew of neglect. It carried something else, something that made his stomach lurch and his hands tremble as he scraped away layers of packed soil and rotting timber. The Hartwell property sat 7 miles outside Devil's Fork proper, connected to civilization by a single dirt road that wound through dense stands of white oak and pine. Local records showed the family had lived there since 1922, keeping to themselves with an almost religious devotion to privacy. Jeremiah Hartwell, the patriarch, had purchased the 160 acres from a logging company, paying cash according to the deed Morrison found nailed inside a kitchen cabinet. What Morrison discovered that sweltering afternoon went far beyond property boundaries and surveying stakes. As he carefully excavated the makeshift burial ground, a pattern emerged that would haunt investigators for years to come. The skulls weren't randomly scattered. They were arranged in neat rows, sorted by size, with the smallest no larger than a child's fist and the largest bearing the heavy brow ridges of full-grown adults. Between the bone fragments, Morrison found personal effects that painted an even more chilling picture. Wedding rings still circled finger bones that had long since separated from their owners. A child's wooden toy horse lay nestled against a rib cage. Most disturbing of all were the dinner plates, fine china scattered throughout the burial site, some still bearing traces of what laboratory analysis would later confirm as human tissue. The Hartwell family had vanished without a trace in March of 1946, leaving behind only empty rooms and a cellar that told a story too horrible for the human mind to easily process. Neighbors reported seeing smoke from the chimney one day and nothing the next, as if the earth had simply swallowed them whole. But Morrison's discovery revealed they hadn't been taken by the earth at all. As the late afternoon sun slanted through the broken windows above, casting shadows across his grisly find, Morrison noticed something that made his blood run cold. Carved into the wooden support beam above the burial site, in letters blackened by smoke and age, were the words, "The Hungry Years, 1922 to 1946. Before we dive deeper into what those hungry years really meant, take a moment to let us know where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. The story you're about to hear spans decades of darkness, so if you're finding this as unsettling as we did while researching it, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want to make sure you don't miss the disturbing details that are still coming, subscribe now, because what Morrison found beneath those floorboards was just the beginning. The official investigation wouldn't begin for another 3 days, but by then, Morrison had already uncovered evidence that the Hartwell family hadn't just been hiding bodies in their cellar. They'd been preparing meals with them. Sheriff Douglas Kellerman had seen death in many forms during his 15 years of law enforcement, but nothing had prepared him for the neat stack of human femur bones arranged like cordwood in the Hartwell cellar, each one showing identical knife marks where the meat had been systematically carved away. The precision of the cuts suggested someone with intimate knowledge of butchering or years of practice. What Morrison had stumbled upon would become the most extensive crime scene investigation in West Virginia's history, revealing a family operation so methodical it defied comprehension. Kellerman arrived at the Devil's Fork property on August 15, 1947, accompanied by State Police Detective Raymond Cross and Dr. Elizabeth Thorne, the region's only forensic pathologist. The trio descended into the cellar armed with kerosene, lanterns, and cameras, unprepared for the systematic horror that awaited them below ground level. Dr. Thorne's preliminary examination revealed that the bones showed no signs of natural decay patterns typically associated with burial. Instead, they displayed evidence of deliberate processing, scoring marks along the shafts, separation points that indicated joints had been carefully disarticulated, and most chilling of all, evidence of boiling. The larger bones had been cracked open, likely to extract marrow, while smaller fragments showed signs of having been ground into powder. Detective Cross focused his attention on the kitchen area above, where the true scope of the Hartwell operation began to emerge. Behind a false wall constructed of rough-hewn planks, he discovered a second pantry that contained dozens of mason jars filled with preserved human fat, labeled with dates spanning from 1923 to 1945. The labels were written in a careful feminine script, suggesting the family's women had been deeply involved in the preservation process. The most disturbing discovery came when Dr. Thorne examined the kitchen's cast iron stove. Embedded in the firebox, she found fragments of human teeth, molars, and incisors that had survived the flames that consumed their owner's flesh. The stove's unusually large size now made terrible sense. It had been modified to accommodate cooking on an industrial scale. Cross's investigation of the property's perimeter revealed a sophisticated system for luring victims to their deaths. A hand-painted sign reading, "Hartwell's Inn, Travelers Welcome," had been hidden beneath decades of kudzu growth along the main road. The family had operated as an informal way station for travelers crossing the remote mountain territory, offering food and shelter to those unfortunate enough to accept their hospitality. But the Hartwells hadn't simply been opportunistic killers waiting for random victims to stumble into their web. Dr. Thorne's bone analysis revealed something far more calculated. The skeletal remains showed a deliberate selection process. The bones belonged to adults in their prime, children of specific ages, and elderly individuals who would have been traveling alone. Missing person reports from surrounding counties painted a picture of systematic hunting that stretched across 3 states and 2 decades. The family had been conducting what amounted to a sustained campaign of predation, targeting those society was least likely to miss. Drifters seeking work in the coal mines, widowed farmers traveling to distant markets, children whose families had been torn apart by the economic devastation of the 1930s. The Hartwells had become human wolves, culling the vulnerable from the edges of civilization. Sheriff Kellerman's examination of the property's outbuildings uncovered the infrastructure that had made such an operation possible. A smokehouse behind the main residence contained hooks and pulleys designed for processing large game, but the staining patterns on the wooden walls told a different story. A root cellar had been converted into a holding area, complete with heavy wooden doors and iron restraints bolted into the stone walls. Most revealing of all was the family's meticulous record-keeping. Cross discovered a leather-bound ledger hidden beneath loose floorboards in what appeared to have been Jeremiah Hartwell's study. The entries, written in multiple hands over the years, documented not just the murders, but the yield from each victim, weight of usable meat, quality of the fat for rendering, even notes about flavor and cooking methods. One entry, dated October 12, 1934, read, "Miller family, 4 persons, traveling to Cincinnati. Children tender, father tough, but good for smoking. Wife excellent for winter stores. Disposed of wagon and horses in usual manner." The ledger revealed that the Hartwells hadn't just been consuming their victims. They'd been selling preserved human meat to unwitting customers throughout the region, marketing it as venison and pork to local establishments and traveling merchants. The scope of their operation suggested that hundreds of people had unknowingly consumed human flesh prepared in the Hartwell kitchen. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the investigation was what it revealed about the family's motivation. This hadn't been a desperate act of survival during hard times, nor the work of mentally unstable individuals driven by uncontrollable urges. The evidence pointed to something far more disturbing. The Hartwells had simply preferred the taste of human flesh to any other meat, and had built their entire lives around satisfying that preference as efficiently as possible. As the sun set on that August day, casting long shadows across the property that had harbored such systematic evil, one question haunted every member of the investigation team. If the Hartwell family had vanished in March of 1946, who had been feeding on strangers for the 16 months since their disappearance? The teeth marks embedded in Sarah Chen's left ulna told a story that no amount of investigative training could have prepared Detective Cross to read they were human bite marks preserved in bone after decades underground, showing where someone had gnawed the flesh from a living person's arm. The forensic evidence emerging from Devil's Fork was rewriting everything investigators thought they knew about the boundaries of human cruelty. Each bone fragment recovered from the Hartwell property represented not just a life lost, but a final moment of unimaginable terror experienced by ordinary people whose only crime had been seeking shelter from strangers. Dr. Thorne's methodical cataloging of the remains revealed the true scope of the family's appetite. Working 16-hour days in a makeshift laboratory established in Devil's Fork's abandoned schoolhouse, she began reconstructing the victims' final stories through forensic analysis that would later become standard practice in murder investigations nationwide. The bone evidence painted portraits of lives cut short with deliberate, practiced efficiency. The remains of the Chen family immigrants traveling west in search of railroad work in 1928 showed evidence of prolonged captivity. Stress fractures in their leg bones indicated they had been confined for weeks, possibly months, before their deaths. The condition of their teeth revealed periods of starvation alternated with forced feeding, suggesting the Hartwells had been fattening their victims like livestock before slaughter. Cross's investigation into missing persons reports from the period revealed a pattern that extended far beyond random opportunism. The Hartwells had been targeting specific types of travelers with methodical precision. Families with young children comprised 60% of the victims, their bones showing that the family had harvested them in a specific order, children first, then mothers, leaving fathers for last, to witness the systematic destruction of their families. But the most disturbing discovery came when Dr. Thorne examined what appeared to be the oldest remains in the collection. Carbon dating revealed bones that predated the Hartwells' official arrival at Devil's Fork by nearly a decade, suggesting they had been practicing their craft elsewhere before establishing their permanent operation in West Virginia. The implications were staggering. The 43 skulls Morrison had found represented only the final chapter of a much longer story of predation. Sheriff Kellerman's team expanded their search to include the property's extensive root cellar system, a network of underground chambers that had been carved into the hillside over decades. In the deepest chamber, they discovered evidence that the family had been experimenting with different preservation techniques, testing methods for extending the shelf life of human meat in an era before reliable refrigeration. The walls of this chamber bore scratch tallies that Dr. Thorne estimated represented over 200 individual victims spanning the family's entire operation. Each mark had been carved with obsessive precision, suggesting someone in the family had taken pride in maintaining accurate records of their harvest. Beneath the tallies, investigators found children's drawings etched into the stone, primitive figures of people hanging from hooks, drawn by hands too small to have understood the true meaning of what they depicted. Detective Cross's reconstruction of the family's methodology revealed a level of organization that challenged every assumption about criminal psychology. The Hartwells hadn't been driven by hunger or desperation. They had been operating what amounted to a human processing facility with the same attention to efficiency and profit maximization that characterized legitimate businesses of the era. A detailed examination of their ledger revealed pricing structures for different cuts of meat, seasonal variations in availability, and even customer preferences noted for repeat buyers. One entry from December 19, 1936, documented a standing order from a boarding house in nearby Millfield for special holiday provisions delivered monthly throughout the winter season. The investigation team's most shocking discovery came when they began cross-referencing the Hartwell's sales records with local businesses that had operated during their active years. Restaurant owners, boarding house proprietors, and even some of the region's more prominent families had apparently been regular customers, unknowingly serving human flesh to their own patrons and dinner guests for over 2 decades. Mrs. Agnes Whitmore, who had operated Whitmore's Tavern in Devil's Fork from 1925 to 1941, became physically ill when Cross showed her copies of the Hartwell ledger entries documenting regular meat deliveries to her establishment. Her tearful confession revealed that she had always wondered why the Hartwell venison had such an unusually rich flavor that kept customers coming back for more. The psychological profile emerging from the evidence suggested that the Hartwells had developed their taste for human flesh, gradually beginning with a single opportunistic murder and discovering they preferred it to conventional meat. Over time, they had rationalized their predation as a form of superior lifestyle choice, viewing their victims not as fellow humans, but as a premium food source that conventional society was too squeamish to appreciate. But the investigation's most puzzling aspect remained the question of the family's own disappearance. The meticulous records that had documented every aspect of their operation ended abruptly on March 7, 1946, with no indication of why they had abandoned a perfectly functioning enterprise at the height of its profitability. Cross's examination of the property's final months revealed signs of hasty departure, personal belongings left scattered throughout the house, preserved meat abandoned in the smokehouse, and most telling of all, evidence that someone had attempted to burn the incriminating ledger, but had been interrupted before completing the destruction. As the August sun set behind the hills surrounding Devil's Fork, casting the abandoned property in shadows that seemed to writhe with the weight of its secrets, Detective Cross found himself confronting a question that would haunt him for the rest of his career. If the Hartwell family had been forced to flee their operation in such haste, what had frightened them badly enough to abandon everything they had spent decades building? The blood spatter on the kitchen wall formed a pattern that Dr. Thorne had never encountered in 15 years of forensic work. Arterial spray from multiple sources, all converging toward the cellar entrance, as if several people had been dragged bleeding toward the underground chambers where the Hartwell family had processed their victims. But this blood was different, fresher than the decades-old stains that marked the family's long reign of terror. The evidence suggested that in their final days at Devil's Fork, the Hartwells themselves had become prey. Detective Cross's examination of the main house revealed signs of a violent struggle that had occurred sometime in early March of 1946, weeks before the family's disappearance. Furniture had been overturned and never righted. Windows on the second floor showed impact damage consistent with someone trying to escape from inside the house. Most telling of all, the family's prized ledger contained its final entry written in a shaking hand, dramatically different from the careful script that had documented 24 years of systematic murder. The last entry, dated March 5, 1946, read simply, "They know. God help us. They know." Sheriff Kellerman's investigation into the family's final weeks began with interviews of the few neighbors who lived within 10 miles of the Hartwell property. Martha Kendrick, whose farm sat closest to the main road, remembered seeing unusual activity around the property in late February of 1946. Multiple vehicles arriving after dark, figures moving through the woods with lanterns, and sounds that she described as like animals fighting, but worse. Mrs. Kendrick's most disturbing recollection involved a conversation she'd overheard between her husband and Jeremiah Hartwell at the Devil's Fork General Store on February 28th. According to her testimony, Hartwell had appeared haggard and paranoid, asking repeatedly about strangers who might have been asking questions about his family. He had specifically inquired whether anyone had been seen examining property records or interviewing longtime residents about the area's history. The investigation team's search of the property's outbuildings uncovered evidence that someone else had been conducting their own investigation of the Hartwell operation in the weeks before the family's disappearance. Hidden beneath loose boards in the smokehouse, Cross discovered a leather satchel containing photographs, handwritten notes, and copies of missing persons reports dating back to 1923. The handwriting in the notes belonged to someone with law enforcement training. The observations were methodical, clinical, and demonstrated knowledge of investigative techniques that wouldn't have been available to casual researchers. Most significantly, the notes contained detailed floor plans of the Hartwell house and cellar system, suggesting the author had conducted extensive surveillance of the property before making contact with the family. Dr. Thorne's analysis of the fresh blood evidence revealed that it belonged to at least 4 different individuals, none of whom matched any of the historical victims found in the burial site. The blood had been spilled in a specific pattern that suggested the victims had been systematically executed, rather than killed, in the chaotic manner typical of the Hartwell's usual methods. But the most chilling discovery came when Cross examined the family's personal quarters on the second floor of the house. In what appeared to have been Jeremiah Hartwell's bedroom, investigators found a cache of letters hidden behind a loose stone in the fireplace. The correspondence revealed that someone had been blackmailing the family for months before their disappearance, demanding increasingly large sums of money in exchange for silence about their activities. The blackmail letters, written on expensive stationery and posted from different cities across 3 states, demonstrated intimate knowledge of the family's operation. The author referenced specific victims by name, quoted exact passages from the family ledger, and provided details about the Hartwell's customer network that could only have been obtained through direct observation or inside information. One letter, dated January 15, 1946, contained a particularly ominous warning. Your 24 years of feeding on the innocent are coming to an end. You have until the spring thaw to make arrangements for your final payment, or arrangements will be made for you. Cross's investigation into the letter's origins led him to examine postal records from surrounding communities, where he discovered that similar correspondence had been sent to several of the Hartwell's former customers. The blackmailer hadn't been content to extort just the family. They had been systematically exposing the entire network of unwitting accomplices who had purchased and consumed human flesh over the decades. The investigation team's reconstruction of the final confrontation began with evidence found in the cellar itself. Bullet holes in the stone walls suggested a gun battle had taken place in the underground chambers where the family had committed their worst atrocities. Shell casings recovered from the scene were from weapons that didn't match any firearms found on the property, indicating the attackers had been well armed and prepared for resistance. Dr. Thorne's examination of the cellar's final crime scene revealed that the Hartwell family had been killed in the same location where they had murdered dozens of victims over the years. The positioning of the blood evidence suggested they had been forced to kneel in the exact spots where they had once butchered travelers, experiencing the same terror they had inflicted on others for more than 2 decades. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the evidence was what it suggested about the killer's motivation. The execution had been carried out with ritualistic precision, mirroring the methodical approach the Hartwells themselves had used on their victims. Whoever had ended the family's reign of terror hadn't simply been seeking justice. They had been delivering a very specific form of revenge. As the investigation team prepared to leave the property on that late August evening, Cross made one final discovery that would haunt him for years to come. Carved into the cellar wall above the spot where the Hartwell family had met their end were the words, "The hunt continues." The message had been carved recently, its edges still sharp and unweathered, suggesting it had been left as a warning for anyone who might follow in the family's footsteps. But it also raised a terrifying possibility that the investigators were only beginning to comprehend. What if the Hartwells hadn't been unique predators operating in isolation, but part of something larger, a network of families who had developed the same taste for human flesh and had been systematically eliminated by someone determined to hunt the hunters? The telegram that arrived at Sheriff Kellerman's office on September 3, 1947, contained only 7 words, but they would transform the Devil's Fork investigation from a local murder case into a federal manhunt spanning 12 states. Found 3 more families, same methods. Come immediately. The sender identified himself as Agent Thomas Brennan, Federal Bureau of Investigation. What had begun as an isolated case of cannibalistic murder was about to reveal itself as part of a coordinated network of human predators that had been operating across rural America for decades. Agent Brennan's arrival in Devil's Fork brought with him a collection of case files that painted a picture of systematic horror extending far beyond the Hartwell property. Similar discoveries had been made in isolated locations throughout Kentucky, Tennessee, and North Carolina remote farmsteads, where families had been luring travelers to their deaths and consuming their flesh with the same methodical precision demonstrated by the Hartwells. The Bureau's investigation had begun 18 months earlier, when Agent Brennan, working a missing persons case in rural Kentucky, discovered the abandoned Wickham farm outside Hazard. Like the Hartwell property, the Wickham homestead contained a cellar filled with human remains and evidence of systematic cannibalism. The family had vanished without explanation, leaving behind the same type of meticulous records that documented their victims and their preference for human meat over conventional food sources. Dr. Thorne's analysis of the evidence Brennan brought from the other sites revealed disturbing similarities that suggested coordination between the families. The bone processing techniques were identical across all locations. The victim selection criteria matched perfectly. Most significantly, the ledger systems used the same coding methods and abbreviations, indicating the families had been trained by a common source or had been sharing information about their methods. Detective Cross's examination of the interconnected evidence revealed that the families had been operating as nodes in a larger network, sharing victims, trading preserved meat, and coordinating their activities to avoid detection. Railroad schedules found among the Hartwell papers matched similar documents discovered at the other sites, suggesting the families had been timing their hunting activities to coincide with predictable patterns of travelers moving through their regions. Agent Brennan's most shocking revelation came when he shared the Bureau's analysis of missing persons reports from across the affected regions. Over a 40-year period, nearly 2,000 people had disappeared while traveling through areas controlled by the cannibal families. The missing included entire wagon trains in the 1880s, automobile travelers in the 1920s and 30s, and even small groups of railroad workers who had vanished while working on remote sections of track. The investigation team's examination of the family's correspondence revealed they had been communicating through a sophisticated mail forwarding system that had allowed them to share information while maintaining their isolated locations. Letters discovered at each site were written in the same coded language, discussing livestock quality, harvest yields, and preservation techniques in terms that initially appeared to reference legitimate farming operations. But the Bureau's cryptanalysis revealed that the codes referred to human victims, their ages, physical condition, and suitability for different forms of consumption. The families had been raiding their prey like cattle, trading information about the best hunting grounds, and even arranging exchanges when one location had surplus inventory and another was experiencing shortages. Dr. Thorne's forensic analysis of the victim remains from all 4 sites revealed evidence of systematic experimentation that suggested the network had been refining their techniques over decades. Early victims showed crude butchering methods and inefficient meat extraction, while later remains demonstrated sophisticated processing that maximized the yield from each body and minimized waste. The families had been learning from each other, sharing innovations in hunting, killing, and processing techniques that had allowed them to operate with increasing efficiency and reduced risk of detection. They had essentially industrialized cannibalism, turning human predation into a sustainable enterprise that could support entire family units across multiple generations. Agent Brennan's investigation into the family's origins revealed they had all traced their ancestry to a single community in rural Virginia that had been disbanded in the 1870s following accusations of witchcraft and devil worship. County records from the period documented the forced relocation of several families who had been accused of practicing unnatural rites and consuming human flesh in communion with dark forces. The scattered descendants of this original community had apparently maintained contact across the generations, preserving and refining their ancestors' practices while adapting them to the changing landscape of American society. They had evolved from isolated cult members into sophisticated predators who understood how to exploit the anonymity of modern travel and the limitations of rural law enforcement. But Agent Brennan's most disturbing discovery involved the identity of the person who had been systematically eliminating the cannibal families. The investigation had revealed that someone with intimate knowledge of the network's operations and locations had been methodically hunting down each family unit and executing them with ritualistic precision. The killer's methods showed the same level of planning and preparation that had characterized the cannibal families themselves. Each execution had been preceded by months of surveillance and investigation. The families had been killed in locations that held specific significance to their crimes: cellars where they had butchered victims, kitchens where they had prepared human meat, dining rooms where they had consumed their prey. Cross's analysis of the evidence from all 4 sites revealed that the executioner had been leaving the same message at each location: the hunt continues. But the Bureau's handwriting analysis suggested the messages had been written by different people, indicating that multiple individuals were involved in the systematic elimination of the cannibal network. As Agent Brennan prepared to brief the investigation team on the Bureau's most startling discovery, he revealed that they had identified the likely source of the network's destruction. The executioners weren't law enforcement officers or vigilantes seeking justice for the family's crimes. They were survivors, the children and relatives of victims who had spent decades tracking down every member of the cannibal network, learning their methods, and systematically eliminating them using the same techniques their loved ones had suffered through before death. The photograph tucked inside Mary Catherine Sullivan's Bible showed a young girl with braided pigtails standing beside a covered wagon, her smile bright with the promise of a new life in Colorado. But that little girl had never reached her destination, having been butchered and consumed by the Wickham family in October of 1929. Her older sister had spent 18 years planning the revenge that finally came to fruition in the spring of 1946. The systematic elimination of America's cannibal families hadn't been the work of law enforcement or random vigilantes. It had been orchestrated by a network of survivors whose patient planning and methodical execution rivaled the very predators they sought to destroy. Agent Brennan's investigation into the executioners' identities revealed a story of survival and vengeance that stretched back decades. Catherine Sullivan had been 12 years old when her family's wagon was attacked by the Wickhams during their westward journey. She had escaped only by hiding beneath her dead mother's body for 3 days, listening to the sounds of her family being butchered and cooked in the farmhouse above her hiding spot. Sullivan's testimony, given to federal agents in a Cincinnati safe house in September of 1947, revealed how she had spent nearly 2 decades tracking down not just her family's killers, but every member of the network that had supported them. She had learned to read the coded correspondence between the families, identified their hunting territories, and mapped out their entire operation with the thoroughness of a military intelligence officer. But Sullivan hadn't been working alone. Agent Brennan's investigation uncovered evidence of a sophisticated organization of survivors who had found each other through years of patient investigation and shared trauma. They called themselves the Reckoning, and their membership included dozens of individuals who had lost family members to the cannibal network over a span of 40 years. Dr. Thorne's analysis of evidence collected from the execution sites revealed that the survivors had been methodically documenting their revenge campaign with the same obsessive attention to detail that had characterized their calm. Targets. Hidden caches discovered at each location contained detailed surveillance reports, victim lists, and photographic evidence that the survivors had been gathering intelligence on the cannibal families for decades. The Reckoning's operational structure mirrored the network they were destroying. Members were organized into cells that operated independently while sharing intelligence through coded communications. They had infiltrated communities surrounding the cannibal families, taking jobs as shopkeepers, postal workers, and traveling salesmen that gave them access to information about their targets' activities and movements. Detective Cross's examination of the Reckoning's records revealed the extraordinary lengths to which the survivors had gone to ensure their revenge was both complete and permanent. They had traced bloodlines going back 4 generations, identifying not just the active cannibal families, but also distant relatives who might carry the same predatory instincts. Their target list included over 300 individuals spread across 15 states. The survivors' methods showed a level of psychological sophistication that suggested some members had received formal training in intelligence gathering and execution techniques. Their surveillance operations included detailed behavioral analyses of their targets, identification of family hierarchies and decision-making structures, and careful timing to ensure maximum psychological impact. Agent Brennan's interviews with captured Reckoning members revealed that they had been preparing for their campaign since the early 1930s, establishing false identities, acquiring weapons and equipment, and training in the skills necessary to infiltrate and destroy their targets. Some had spent years living in communities near the cannibal families, building relationships and gathering intelligence while waiting for orders to strike. The organization's most valuable asset had been information provided by surviving victims who had managed to escape from the cannibal families over the years. These individuals had provided detailed descriptions of the family's compounds, operational methods, and security measures that had allowed the Reckoning to plan their attacks with devastating effectiveness. Dr. Thorne's forensic analysis of the execution sites revealed that the survivors had deliberately mimicked the cannibals' own methods when carrying out their revenge. Victims had been killed using the same tools and techniques they had employed on their prey, and their bodies had been disposed of in ways that mirrored the processing methods found in the family's cellars and smokehouses. But the Reckoning's campaign had involved more than simple execution of the cannibal families. Agent Brennan's investigation revealed that the survivors had also been systematically destroying the network's infrastructure, burning down safe houses, eliminating supply lines, and exposing the businesses and individuals who had unknowingly supported the cannibals' operations. The survivors had even gone so far as to track down and confront the customers who had purchased human meat from the families, forcing them to face the reality of their unwitting participation in the network's crimes. Several prominent citizens in communities throughout Appalachia had been driven to suicide after being presented with evidence of their consumption of human flesh. Cross's analysis of the Reckoning's operational timeline revealed that the survivors had been conducting their campaign for nearly a decade before the discovery of the Hartwell property. The Devil's Fork investigation had been triggered not by chance discovery, but by deliberate exposure orchestrated by the survivors to ensure that the full scope of the cannibal network would be revealed to law enforcement. The survivors had carefully preserved evidence from each execution site, creating a comprehensive record of their campaign that would serve as both justification for their actions and a warning to any potential successors to the cannibal families. They had documented every aspect of their investigation and revenge, ensuring that their story would survive, even if they were captured or killed. But Agent Brennan's most disturbing discovery was that the Reckoning's campaign wasn't finished. Intelligence gathered from captured members suggested that additional cannibal families remained active in remote locations across the American frontier, and the survivors were already planning their next phase of operations. As the federal investigation entered its final stages in the autumn of 1947, one question continued to haunt Agent Brennan and his team. If the survivors had been so thorough in their intelligence gathering and so methodical in their planning, how many more secrets about America's hidden predators were they still keeping, and what other horrors were they preparing to reveal? The courtroom in Charleston fell silent as Catherine Sullivan raised her weathered hands to show the jury the scars that covered her palms knife wounds she had inflicted on herself at age 12 to stay awake while hiding beneath her mother's corpse. Listening to the Wickham family prepare her siblings for their dinner table, her testimony would close the most extraordinary trial in American legal history, and her fate would determine whether justice could ever truly be served for crimes that existed beyond the boundaries of civilized law. The federal government's prosecution of the Reckoning survivors would establish legal precedents that still influence how courts handle cases involving systematic revenge against organized criminal enterprises. Judge William Hartford presided over proceedings that began in November of 1947, facing the unprecedented challenge of adjudicating crimes committed against criminals whose own actions had been so heinous that traditional concepts of justice seemed inadequate. The prosecution, led by Federal Attorney General's office, argued that vigilante justice, regardless of motivation, could not be permitted in a civilized society. The defense, however, presented evidence that challenged every assumption about criminal law and victims' rights. Sullivan's lead attorney, Marcus Wellspring, argued that his clients had been engaged not in criminal activity, but in a form of warfare against an enemy that had declared war on humanity itself. The cannibal families, he contended, had forfeited their right to legal protection when they began systematically hunting and consuming other human beings. Agent Brennan's testimony revealed the extraordinary scope of the Reckoning's intelligence operation. Over 15 years, the survivors had compiled evidence that would have taken law enforcement agencies decades to gather if they had ever discovered the cannibal network at all. The organization had documented nearly 4,000 individual crimes, identified victims whose disappearances had never been officially reported, and preserved evidence that would otherwise have been lost forever. Dr. Thorne's expert testimony provided the scientific foundation for understanding what the survivors had accomplished. Her analysis of the cannibal family's remains confirmed that the Reckoning had succeeded in eliminating what appeared to be every active member of a network that had been operating for over 60 years. The survivors hadn't simply sought revenge. They had conducted a systematic campaign of eradication that had effectively ended a multi-generational criminal enterprise. But the trial's most dramatic moment came when Sullivan took the stand to describe her 18-year investigation into her family's murders. Her testimony revealed that she had spent years living in communities throughout Appalachia, working as a seamstress, teacher, and shopkeeper, while gathering intelligence on the cannibal families and building the network that would eventually become the Reckoning. Sullivan's description of her surveillance of the Wickham family provided a chilling glimpse into the patience and determination that had driven the survivors' campaign. She had watched the family for 3 years before making contact, learning their routines, identifying their victims, and documenting their activities with the thoroughness of a trained intelligence operative. The prosecution's case faltered when they attempted to demonstrate that conventional law enforcement could have handled the cannibal network through normal channels. Agent Brennan's cross-examination revealed that federal authorities had received reports about suspicious activities in rural communities for decades, but had dismissed them as folklore and superstition. Without the Reckoning's investigation, the cannibal families would likely have continued operating indefinitely. Judge Hartford's ruling, delivered on February 14, 1948, established legal principles that would influence American jurisprudence for generations. He found that while the Reckoning's methods had technically violated federal and state laws, their actions had been necessary to address crimes that existing legal systems were incapable of prosecuting or preventing. The survivors were sentenced to time already served and released under federal supervision, with the understanding that they would cooperate fully with ongoing investigations into the cannibal network's activities. Sullivan and her fellow members were effectively recruited as federal consultants, using their expertise to help law enforcement agencies identify and investigate similar criminal enterprises. But the trial's conclusion revealed that the Reckoning's work was far from finished. Agent Brennan's final report documented evidence of additional cannibal families operating in remote locations throughout the Western Territories, suggesting that the network had been even larger than originally suspected. The survivors' intelligence indicated that some families had learned about the campaign against their associates and had gone into deeper hiding. Sullivan's post-trial interviews revealed that the Reckoning had evolved into something resembling a federal task force, working with law enforcement agencies to investigate reports of cannibalism and systematic murder in isolated communities across the frontier. Their expertise in tracking and identifying human predators had made them invaluable assets in the government's efforts to extend effective law enforcement to America's most remote regions. The Devil's Fork investigation officially closed in March of 1948, but its impact extended far beyond the immediate case. Federal agencies established new protocols for investigating missing persons cases in rural areas, implemented systems for coordinating information between local law enforcement agencies, and developed specialized training for officers dealing with crimes involving organized networks of predators. Dr. Thorne's forensic techniques, developed during the investigation, became standard practice in murder investigations nationwide. Her methods for analyzing victim remains and reconstructing crime scenes from fragmentary evidence revolutionized criminal investigation and helped solve hundreds of cold cases in subsequent decades. The Hartwell property was eventually sold to the federal government and converted into a training facility for law enforcement agencies studying organized crime and systematic murder. The cellar where so many victims had met their end became a classroom where investigators learned to recognize the signs of human trafficking and systematic predation. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the Devil's Fork case was its revelation that America's remote communities harbored secrets that conventional society could barely comprehend. The cannibal families hadn't been isolated aberrations, they had been part of a hidden landscape of predation that stretched across the continent, operating in the spaces between civilized settlements where traditional law enforcement couldn't reach. As the last members of the Reckoning faded into the roles of federal consultants and expert witnesses, their legacy lived on in the form of investigative techniques and legal precedents that continue to influence how authorities approach cases involving systematic criminal enterprises. Their patient, methodical campaign had not only eliminated a network of predators, but had also established new standards for justice in cases where conventional legal systems proved inadequate. The story of Devil's Fork stands as a testament to the power of human determination in the face of unimaginable evil, and a reminder that justice sometimes emerges from the most unexpected sources. But it also serves as a warning that America's vast frontier continues to harbor secrets that most people would prefer to believe exist only in nightmares. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even stranger. Subscribe before it drops.